everybody, Laura from Silver Threads here. Today we're going to be starting to finish our socks. So this is part 3 of our 3-part sock tutorial. First part we would have started working in the round and then working down to our heel. Second part we tackled the heel, and the third part today we're going to be starting our toe decreases and then working on Kitchener'ing the toe together. So this will kind of be done in 2 little parts, and I will show you how to do the decreases and then also how to Kitchener. And then you will be done with your socks. So you should have knit your sock to within 2 inches of how long you want the final length to be. So you'll want to be measuring from the base of your heel here up to where your needles are, and that is going to be what goes across the bottom of your foot. So like I said, you make sure you are measuring from the end of your heel here when you do this measurement. And you want to stop 2 inches before the total length of your foot. So if you were to measure the length of your foot, and like I have a size 7 foot, so my foot is actually 9 inches long, but that means I want this length here to be 7 inches before starting my decreases, because the actual knitting of the toe takes up about 2 inches. So we are at that point on both of my socks here. I've got it on the double points and I've got it on the magic loop. And the reason I wanted to show this part, I know all of you know how to decrease. This is something that should be fairly intuitive, but I just wanted to mention it because it's going to look a little different on both socks. So on the magic loop sock, or actually let me start with the double point one first, because we are following Susan B. Anderson's pattern, and it is written for double points. So let me show you the way she's going to be mentioning it happening, and then I'll show you what it actually looks like on the magic loop sock too. So this is where remembering which needle was which wasn't too critical while you were knitting the actual body of your foot, but now it's going to become a little more important remembering which one was needle 1, which one was needle 2, and which needle was needle 3. Because at this point we're going to start decreasing at the beginning and ends of certain needles, and it's a little important that you do it in the right spot, otherwise you'll end up with a decrease on the bottom of your foot instead of the side, and that's not quite where you want it. So on her pattern, she's going to have you knit to the last 3 stitches at the end of needle 1, do a decrease here, and then you're going to do a decrease at the beginning and end of needle 2. And then when you start on needle 3 again, you'll be doing a decrease at the beginning of needle 3. You do not want to decrease here. These needles you don't want to decrease here, because this will, like I said, put a decrease in the middle of your foot, and that's not where you want it. You want it to be on the edges as you decrease your toes. And then on the magic loop sock, where you're going to want to decrease is you're going to want to decrease at the beginning and end of each needle. So I find it a little more intuitive with magic loop to keep track of where you need to do them, because you do a decrease on every needle in the same spot on every needle. So you don't have to keep quite as much track. And that is pretty much it for your decreases. So I'll actually show you, let's see, I'm trying to think which one would be most beneficial for you to see it on. I'll show you on the double points. So you're actually gonna, like I said, knit to the end of needle 1. Like I said, this might be just old hat because you all know how to decrease by this point. If you didn't know, you will have figured it out while doing your heel. So I know you all know how to decrease. But I just, like I said, want to make sure that you end up putting them in the right spot. So at the end of needle 1, you're going to knit 2 together and knit 1. And that will be, if we were on the magic loop one, that would be right here. Turn it around. And then because we're at the beginning of needle 2, we need to decrease here. Again, just kind of keeping in mind, you're doing this on the sides of your sock. So if you kind of can keep oriented and remember where your sides are, this will be easier too. So knit 1, do an SSK, and knit to the last 3 stitches. And you're going to do this every other round. So you're going to knit a round plain in between and then decrease every other round. And you will do that until you have 12 stitches left total, and she'll tell you on the double points in particular how to rearrange them. You will not have to rearrange them on the magic loop. You will end up with 6 stitches left on each needle when you're done. Okay, so we're to the last 3 stitches. Knit those 2 together, hopefully. Knit 1. I made that look really sloppy. Got stabbed with my own double point. Okay, and then we turn it, and again, because we're wanting to decrease on the sides of the sock, we're going to go ahead and decrease at the beginning of needle 3. So we're going to knit 1 and do an SSK and knit to the end of needle 3. Again, if you were doing that on the magic loop, what that would look like is you're decreasing at just at the beginning and the end of each needle. So whichever side's facing you, you're increasing at the beginning and the end. And just make sure that you're just keeping track of which round you're on so you don't just keep continually decreasing. But that's it. So I will get these toes knit up to where we're ready to Kitchener them, and then I'll be back and show you how to do that. Okay, we are back with the next part of our socks. To finish up the toes, you will have decreased on both sides of your foot. So again, we've got the front of your foot and the back of the foot, and the or the top and bottom, however you want to think about that. And you should have 12 stitches left on both needles, so 24 stitches total. So whether you're doing magic loop or double points, at this very end stage, this is what it'll end up looking like. You will have knit your double pointed stitches onto one needle for needle 1 and 3 will get combined, and then you'll have what's left of needle 2 stitches on one side there. And so there's 12 stitches left on needles whether you're doing double points or magic loop. This next part's going to work the same. So it should look like this, getting ready to start it. And I'm going to show it on the double point part. I think we're going to be doing something called the Kitchener stitch, but I'll be showing you on the double pointed project because I think the yarn's going to be a little easier to see, but you'll be following these same steps the exact same way if you were doing it on magic loop. So the Kitchener stitch is a way of grafting your stitches together so you end up with an invisible seam. If you were to do a 3-needle bind off or something like that on the top of your toe, you could do that, but you're going to end up with a bump and like a ridge, and that could feel uncomfortable, especially if you're wearing your sock in a shoe. So we're typically, every sock pattern I've ever followed has had you Kitchener the top, and I believe it's for that reason. It gives you a nicer finish, and once you learn it, it has a lot of applications. I've used it on cowls to join cowls seamlessly in the round after I finish them. So it's a great stitch to kind of have in your toolbox, and whether you decide to use it or not in other ways, at least you're familiar with it and you can make that decision. The idea of Kitchener is that you're going to be going into each stitch twice. The first time you go into the stitch on the front, and I'm going to show you how to do this across the whole row, but the first time you go into the stitch on the front, you'll be going in knitwise, and the second stitch you always go into purlwise. You flip it when you do it on the back. You want to go in purlwise, and the second stitch you'll want to go into knitwise. And Charles is probably going to be rolling his eyes at me if he ever watches this video, because he has a way he likes to explain this. I'm probably going to butcher it in comparison. So if anyone has issues with this after I teach it, I'm going to refer you to him. But how I like to remember it is it's a 2-step sequence. We're going to knit, purl, and then purl, knit. And if you can get that kind of going in your head, you can get a little bit of a rhythm. Now what makes it a little odd is that we're needing to start the sequence halfway through when we first get started, because you need to kind of create a foundation for these stitches and something to bounce off of. So if you figure, if we were doing it the regular way, where we were doing knit, purl, purl, knit, what you'd be doing is this stitch, by the time it's gotten purled, knit into, well, let's see. Lisa Charles would be doing this so much more smoothly. Let's just get into it. Maybe I'll explain it as we go, and it'll be less abstract and make more sense. So bear with me. We're going to get it done. We'll figure it out. I promise it'll make sense by the end. So to get your foundation started for Kitchener, we're going to go into this first stitch on your front needle, and you're going to want a little bit of a tail. I think I've cut one that's a little bit longer than you need. Usually about 10 to 18 inches is plenty comfortable for you to work with. But you're going to go into this first stitch purlwise and make sure that your yarn is not wrapped over the top of your knitting needle. You want it to always be below it as we do this. So you're going to go into the first stitch purlwise, and see, this is where my tail is going to be a little long. And then you're going to pull it through, and you want to tug it a little snug but not tight. Kind of like when you're casting on, you want your stitches snug but not tight, how there's that kind of happy medium in there. Same thing here. You don't want to cinch it up so hard that it like is pulling too taut, but you don't want it loose either. Okay, and we're going to leave that stitch alone now, and we're going to go to the back and set up our second foundation stitch, which is going to be going into this first stitch on the back needle knitwise and pulling it through. Okay, so our foundation is set up. Now we're going to start that sequence I mentioned at the beginning, where we're going to knit this first stitch, and then we're going to pull it off or slide it off the front needle and let it drop. And then we're going to go into the second stitch purlwise. So remember how we went into that first stitch purlwise the first time? That's where it's technically the second part of the sequence, but we had to do it first to make sure that that had happened to that first stitch. Okay, and then we're going to go to the back needle, and the sequence is knit, purl, purl, knit. So this will be starting with a purl, and slip it through purlwise. Again, making sure that your yarn is staying below your needles. And then we're going to slip that first stitch off the back. And then your second stitch, we're going to go in knitwise. And we're going to leave that one on. Okay, now that was our whole sequence. We did a knit and slipped it off. We did a purl and left it on. We did a purl on the back and slipped it off, and then we did a knit. So now we're going to start that again. Go into the first stitch knitwise, and slip it off the needle, and then go into the next stitch purlwise and leave it on. And then we go to the back and go into the next stitch purlwise, and slip it off, and then go into the next stitch knitwise. I'm making this look harder than it is because I want to make sure you'll be able to see it. Next stitch knitwise and leave it on. Again, I'm making sure that my yarn is staying below my knitting needles. If it gets wrapped up on the top of the knitting needles, it will be, you'll end up with a loop in it. And again, I'm pulling it a little bit snug but not too tight, and I don't know if you can see kind of how that's working up. But it is creating a stitch that looks just like the knit stitches below it and on either side of it. So you shouldn't be able to tell a difference between your Kitchener stitch and the rest of your knitting. It should just blend in seamlessly. Okay, so let's do that sequence again. We're going to go in knitwise, and slip it off, and go in purlwise and leave it on. And then we're going to go in purlwise on the back, and slip it off. And then we're going to go in knitwise and leave it on. Go in knitwise, slip it off, purlwise, and leave it on. Okay, go in purlwise. Yeah, don't leave your tail this long. This is too long. Oh, and see how that got wrapped up on the front of my needle? If that happens, just knock it back down below and it'll be just fine. Okay, and that was a purl stitch. So if you stop in the middle of your sequence and you're not sure where you are, just look at where your yarn is. So we're on the back and the yarn's going in from right to left, right? So that means that that was going in purlwise. So that means that we need to still slip this stitch off. All right, and then because we slipped that stitch off, we're going to go into the next stitch on the back knitwise, and we'll leave it on. Now the one thing I will recommend on Kitchener is do not stop in the middle, especially when you're first learning it. I would recommend finishing your sequence, which is the knit, purl, purl, knit. I wouldn't stop in the middle of that. I would, whatever you can do to, if you have to put it down, make sure you stop after the last stitch on your back needle and before starting the first stitch on your front needle. That way, if you come back to it, you know exactly where you are and you don't have to figure out where you left off, because it is hard. You know, you've got to really be very familiar with the stitch to be able to look down at your knitting and figure out where your yarn is coming from when you're in the middle of it. So it's much easier if you pause in the middle to actually stop, you know, at the end of the sequence instead of in the middle of it. All right, so we're just going to keep doing this. I'm going to knit and slip off. And purl. Leave it on. And purl. Good gracious. I got all caught up. Let's see. I'm holding it, I'll show you too, I'm holding this a little differently. When I do it normally, when I'm not trying to film, I tend to kind of put my finger in between the needles, and I'm worried if I do that now that you won't be able to see it. So you may find holding it, right now I'm holding it from below, that's not giving me quite as much control. So if you find as you're doing this, if you need to adjust the way you're holding it, usually I do an overhand hold on the needles, and that gives me a lot more just control and hold of my fabric. So you can adjust that if you find you need to. Don't feel like you have to hold it the way I am. I usually don't do this. All right, let's see. And see, I stopped in the middle, so now I got to figure this out. Let's see. Oh, and the phone's ringing. I'm going to pause for just a second, and I'll be right back. All right, a little bit of real life at the yarn store there. Didn't want to talk over the phone, so we're going to pick this back up. At this point, we truly have stopped in the middle. So let's see if we can figure this out. Again, like I said, this is hard to do if you haven't done it before. I have learned the hard way to stop in the end and not the middle, so I'm getting a little better at figuring this out. So I can see again that my yarn is coming through this front stitch on my first needle. So that means that I've gone through it purlwise, and that means that that stitch needs to stay on, and I'm set to go to the back. So let's look to our back needle now. And again, we're going to go in purlwise. Oh, another thing you can do is you can also count. So I should have one less stitch on my front needle, right? If I've pulled one off. So 2, 4, 6, 7, 2, 4, 6, 8. Yep, that makes sense. It all lines up. Makes sense that that's where I am. Okay, so we're going to go into the stitch on the back, purlwise, slip him off, then the next stitch, knit, and leave him on. Then we're going to go knit, purl, purl, and knit. Knit, purl, and knit. Knit, purl, purl, knit, and knit, purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl. Oop, caught up on something again. Alright, if that happens, just put your yarn back through the opposite way. See if you can figure out what made it kink, and then try again. Purl, and knit. Now we're down to 2 stitches, but don't worry, we're going to just keep doing this exact same thing. Gonna knit and slip off. And I don't know if you caught that, especially as you get fewer stitches, you may see the ones in the back or the front try to slip off when you're slipping off the stitch on the opposite needle. If that happens, I just kind of pop my finger up and catch them and hold them so they can come up against my finger, but they won't come all the way off. And that will feel easier and more natural the more you do this. Okay, so I pulled that first knit stitch off, so we're going to purl. Now we're going back to the back needle, purl, whoop, and it's pulling over the top again. Make sure it stays below, purl, slip it off, and knit. And we'll pause again and take this back up in just a second. Okay, we're back and we're going to finish this sock. So I just finished going through this back stitch knitwise, I'm sorry, because it was the last stitch, knitwise, and I'm left with 1 stitch on each of my needles. We're going to treat it as if it were the same as if there were more stitches here, even though there's not. So you're going to go ahead and come through this first stitch knitwise, and you're going to pull it off and just let your needle go away. And then going to go into this, because we don't have another one to do on the front, we're going to go right to the back and just go into it purlwise. So you'll go ahead and start with the first part of the sequence for the back needle, which is a purl. Pull it through, and again, just let your needle drop out because there's not another stitch to do. Now it's very normal, well, first let me show you just this nice little edge that you get by doing this. Like, see, it does look like it's just part of the knitting. It should look like you haven't got a seam there at all. It is very normal to get kind of this little bump here where your stitches are, there's extra fabric. All you do to do that, I put my hand actually into the sock, and all you do to take care of that is I just kind of go between the 2 stitches that are below where this little extra bump is, so maybe like a row or 2 down, and I just put my needle into it and I catch it with my hand that's in the sock and I pull my tail through. And when you do that, it's going to kind of take that little extra bump and just tuck it against your sock. So you'll still have it a little bit, but it's, for all intents and purposes, pushed down as far as it'll go, and I tend to give it an extra little tug, and that really tightens that up to where it won't bother you when you wear it and you won't be able to see it either. And that's it. That is the toe of a sock, and you've knit your first pair of socks now. Look at that. Congratulations, and I hope you had fun with it. If you have any questions, let us know.